The prince and the mermaid, the halls of the palace were cloaked in shadow, save for the dim flicker of a single oil lamp resting by the king's bedside. Prince Lysander stood there, his heart heavy, as he watched the frail figure of his father, a man once known as the Iron Sovereign, reduced to a shadow of his former self. The old king's breathing was labored, each exhale a whisper of fading strength. "Come closer," the king rasped, his voice brittle as dry leaves. Lysander obeyed, kneeling at his side. The weight of unspoken words filled the room like the press of a storm. The king's hand, trembling and cold, reached for Lysander's. "You must save them," he murmured, his gaze distant, as though he were staring beyond the confines of the mortal world. "Save whom, father?" Lysander asked, though he already suspected the answer. "Our people," the king replied, his words carrying the gravity of the crown. "The famine, the war. The kingdom is unraveling, and I cannot hold it together. But there is hope, a light in the darkness. You must find the Pearl of Eternal Radiance. It is the only way." Lysander felt his blood run cold. The Pearl of Eternal Radiance was no mere treasure. It was the subject of countless myths, its existence debated by scholars and whispered of by sailors in dimly lit taverns. Legends claimed it was hidden deep beneath the sea, guarded by a creature of unrelenting wrath, a mermaid named Sirena. "But father," Lysander began, his voice tinged with both doubt and fear. "The pearl is a fable, a tale for children." The king's grip tightened, his eyes sharp despite the weakness of his body. "It is real," he hissed. "The blind oracle spoke of it. A pearl that can heal, that can unite kingdoms. But heed my warning. Its guardian despises men. She will test you, and the cost may be greater than you can fathom." The prince bowed his head, the enormity of the task sinking in. His father's life was ebbing away, and his kingdom was crumbling under the weight of war, famine, and despair. If there was even a sliver of truth to the legend, he had no choice but to try. The next morning, the palace courtyard was alive with the sounds of preparation. The finest ship in the royal fleet was readied, its hull reinforced for the treacherous seas Lysander would face. Among the supplies was an enchanted compass, its needle quivering toward unseen forces, and a map etched onto a strange glowing parchment, the gifts of the blind oracle who lived on the edge of the city. The oracle had spoken only once during their meeting, her voice as brittle and cryptic as the old king's. "The pearl lies where the sea meets the soul," she had said. "But tread lightly, for the guardian's wrath is a tempest unto itself." As the sun dipped below the horizon, Lysander stood at the bow of his ship. his gaze fixed on the endless expanse of the ocean. The air was thick with salt and mystery, the waves whispering secrets only the sea could know. "Are you certain of this, Your Highness?" asked Captain Dareth, a grizzled sailor who had seen more storms than most men lived through. "I am," Lysander replied, his voice firm. "For my father, for the kingdom." With that, the ship set sail, leaving the safety of the harbour behind. As they ventured deeper into the open sea, the stars above seemed to grow brighter, their light casting eerie reflections on the water. The enchanted compass in Lysander's hand trembled with purpose, its needle pointing unwaveringly toward the unknown. Days turned to nights, and the journey grew ever more perilous. Strange sights began to emerge, shapes in the water that vanished when looked at directly, whispers carried by the wind that seemed to speak Lysander's name. Yet the compass continued to guide them, its magic unyielding. On the seventh night, as the moon hung full and luminous in the sky, a strange mist began to rise. It crept over the ship like a living thing, damp and cold, obscuring the horizon. Lysander felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. "Captain!" he called, his voice cutting through the unnatural silence. Before Dareth could answer, the mist parted, revealing a shoreline unlike any Lysander had ever seen. The sand was black as obsidian, and the water shimmered with an unearthly glow. In the distance, jagged rocks jutted from the sea, like the teeth of a great beast, their surfaces slick with brine. "The cursed shore," whispered Dareth, his voice trembling. Lysander's jaw tightened. This was the place the oracle had spoken of. The air was thick with enchantment, every sound muted as though the world itself held its breath. He knew this was only the beginning, that the true trial lay ahead, waiting in the depths beyond. With a deep breath, he stepped off the ship, his boots sinking into the otherworldly sand. The journey had begun in earnest, and the pearl, along with the wrath of its guardian, awaited. The sand beneath Prince Lysander's feet was unlike anything he had ever felt, gritty and sharp, as though composed of ground obsidian. The shoreline stretched endlessly in both directions, and the black water lapped against it with a rhythmic hiss, as if breathing. Above him, the mist coiled and twisted like a living thing, shrouding the world in an eerie half-light. The enchanted compass in his hand pulsed faintly, its needle quivering toward the jagged rocks rising in the distance. Each step toward them felt heavier than the last, as though the very ground sought to ensnare him. His breath fogged the cold, enchanted air, carrying a tension that whispered of unseen eyes watching from the shadows. Behind him, Captain Dareth and the crew lingered by the ship, their expressions taut with unease. "Your Highness," Dareth called, his voice strained. "This place, It's wrong. No mud should linger here. I must go alone, Lysander replied, his tone resolute. Stay with the ship. If I do not return by dawn, sail back to Araldwyn. Dareth's face was a mask of conflicting emotions, fear for his prince, duty to his crown. But he nodded. May the gods protect you. Lysander turned away, his gaze fixed on the distant rocks. As he walked, the landscape seemed to shift subtly, the shoreline stretching longer than it should have, the rocks never appearing closer. Time felt disjointed, and the whispers began again, faint and indistinct. Foolish prince, they seemed to say, turn back. Leave the sea to its secrets. Ignoring them, Lysander pressed on. As he approached the rocks, a sudden bone-deep chill swept over him, and the sea began to churn violently. The once calm waves now crashed against the shore with thunderous force, spraying icy salt water into the air. The mist thickened, swirling around him in ghostly tendrils. And then he saw her. From the depths of the black water, a figure emerged, rising with the grace of a shadow slipping through a dream. Her form was ethereal, her long hair flowing like liquid silver, blending seamlessly with the dark waves. Her eyes, the color of storm clouds, glimmered with ancient fury. Sirena. Her voice, when it came, was a melody and a dagger cutting through the air with chilling precision. Another human seeking what does not belong to him, she said, her words laced with disdain. Do you come to steal? To plunder the gifts of the sea as your kind always has? Lysander stood his ground, though every instinct screamed at him to retreat. I seek the Pearl of Eternal Radiance, he said, his voice steady despite the fear coiling in his chest. Not for myself, but to save my kingdom. At this, Sirena laughed, a sound both beautiful and terrible, echoing off the jagged rocks. Save your kingdom? She mocked. How noble! Yet you come with the arrogance of humanity, believing the sea owes you its treasures. Her gaze bore into him, and the waters around her began to rise, forming walls that undulated like living creatures. Do you know the price of the pearl you seek? I am prepared to pay it, Lysander said, though his heart pounded. Sirena's eyes narrowed, and the waves stilled, the silence that followed more unnerving than the storm. You speak of payment, but your kind never understands the cost. The pearl is no mere trinket, no reward for the desperate. It is a test, a reflection of the soul, and I am its guardian. With a graceful motion, she raised her hand, and the black water between them shimmered. From its depths, a melody began to rise, faint at first, but growing in intensity. It was a song unlike any Lysander had heard, haunting and sorrowful, filled with a grief so profound it seemed to pierce his very being. "This is your warning, Prince," Sirena said. "Turn back and I will let you live. But step closer and you will face the song of truth. It will strip you bare, exposing your darkest fears and sins. Few survive its melody." Lysander hesitated, the weight of her words settling on him like a stone. He had heard tales of sailors driven mad by the songs of the mermaids, their minds unraveling under the strain of their own regrets. But the memory of his father's frail hand, his kingdom's suffering, surged within him. "I will face your song," he said, his voice firm. Sirena regarded him with an expression that was almost pitying. "So be it," she whispered. With a sweep of her arm, the melody grew, its haunting strains wrapping around Lysander like a net. The world dissolved into sound, and he felt himself falling, not into water, but into a vast abyss of his own making. Shadows began to rise, their forms shifting into shapes he recognized with growing dread. His trial had begun. The melody surged, weaving itself into the fabric of a Prince Lysander's thoughts. It was no mere song but a force, a living thing that burrowed into his mind, peeling back the layers of his consciousness. The jagged rocks and mist-laden shore faded, and Lysander found himself standing in a vast, featureless expanse, a void that pulsed with the rhythm of the song. A voice, soft and accusatory, rose from the emptiness. "What is a prince but a gilded lie?" it whispered. Shapes began to coalesce in the void. Figures from Lysander's past, their faces etched with expressions of sorrow and betrayal. The first to step forward was a young man, his eyes brimming with hurt. Lysander recognized him instantly. Oren, his childhood friend, whom he had betrayed to gain favor with the royal council. "Why, Lysander?" Oren asked, his voice trembling. "You promised me loyalty, but you used my secrets to climb higher. Was your ambition worth my ruin?" The prince opened his mouth to respond, but his voice failed him. The song swelled, forcing him to confront the memory. He saw himself as he had been, a younger, hungrier version of himself, trading Oren's trust for influence. The guilt struck him like a physical blow. Before he could recover, the scene shifted. A battlefield emerged around him, its air thick with the stench of blood and ash. Soldiers screamed as they fell, their armor slick with crimson. At the center of the carnage stood Lysander, sword in hand, issuing commands. "Hold the line!" his past self bellowed, his face a mask of determination. But Lysander, watching as an outsider, knew the truth. This battle had been unnecessary, a display of power to secure his father's approval. Dozens had perished for his pride. "You knew we couldn't win?" came a voice behind him. Lysander turned to see a soldier, his face pale and gaunt, a fatal wound staining his chest. "But you ordered us forward anyway. You called it duty. Was it worth my pain?" Lysander began, but the soldier vanished, replaced by another, and then another. Faces of those who had died because of his choices. The song pressed harder, the melody twisting into a discordant wail that made his chest tighten. "You see now," Sirena's voice echoed from the void, her tone both mocking and mournful. "The truth cuts deeper than any blade. This is who you are, a prince who sacrifices others for his own gain. Do you still believe you are worthy of the pearl?" Lysander fell to his knees, the weight of his failures crushing him. He had spent his life striving to become the ruler his father wanted. But in doing so, he had left a trail of broken lives and shattered trust. The voices of the fallen swirled around him, their accusations a cacophony that threatened to drown him entirely. But amidst the chaos, a different memory surfaced, a moment of quiet amidst the noise. He saw himself as a child, sitting beside his mother in the palace garden. She had spoken softly, her words carrying the warmth of the sunlight. "A true king is not without fault," she had said. "But he must face his failures with courage and strive to do better. It is not perfection that makes a ruler. It is humility." The memory sparked something within him, a flicker of light in the suffocating darkness. Lysander rose unsteadily to his feet, his voice trembling but firm. "I have made mistakes," he said, his words directed at the spectres surrounding him. "I have caused pain, and I cannot change the past, but I will not let it define me. If I am to save my kingdom, I must be better, not for my own glory, but for those who depend on me." The melody faltered, its relentless grip loosening. The shadows around him began to dissipate, their forms dissolving into the void. Sirena's voice returned, no longer mocking, but contemplative. "You surprise me, Prince," she said. "Few can withstand the song of truth, and fewer still emerge humbled. Perhaps there is hope for you yet." The void shattered like glass, and Lysander found himself back on the cursed shore, the air heavy with the scent of salt and rain. Sirena stood before him, her expression unreadable. "You have passed the first trial," she said, her voice softer now. "But the path to the pearl is not yet complete. You must descend into the abyssal gate and face the trial of the depths. There the true test awaits." Lysander nodded, his resolve hardened by the ordeal. The pearl was no longer just a means to save his kingdom. It was a chance to prove he could be the ruler his people needed. Sirena gestured toward the jagged rocks, where a dark chasm yawned like the mouth of a great beast. "The gate lies there. she said. Tread carefully, for the depths are merciless. With a steadying breath, Lysander stepped toward the abyss, ready to face whatever awaited him below. The abyssal gate loomed before Prince Lysander, a jagged wound in the earth that descended into darkness so profound it seemed to devour light. The air around it was unnaturally cold, and a low hum emanated from its depths, vibrating through the rocks and into Lysander's bones. The enchanted compass in his hand spun wildly now, as though overwhelmed by the forces below. Sirena lingered at the edge of the chasm, her silver hair billowing in an unseen current. The abyssal gate leads to the Pearl's resting place, she said, her voice devoid of the scorn it once held. But beware, it is not a simple journey. The depths reflect your soul. Only those who can master their inner darkness may return. Lysander met her gaze, his expression resolute. I understand, he said. Her lips curved into something between a smile and a grimace. You think you do, but the abyss does not show mercy, even to those with noble intentions. With a final glance, she stepped back, her form melting into the mist. Lysander tightened his grip on the compass and took a step forward. The ground beneath his feet crumbled, and he plunged into the void, the wind rushing past him in a deafening roar. The descent seemed endless, and just as panic began to take root, he landed softly on a surface that felt like liquid, yet held his weight. The darkness around him was absolute, but as he steadied himself, faint glimmers of light began to bloom. They floated like fireflies, casting an otherworldly glow on his surroundings. The air was thick and damp, and the faint hum from above had grown into a symphony of deep, resonant tones. Before him stood a figure, cloaked in shadow and utterly still. As the lights danced closer, the figure stepped forward, and Lysander's breath caught. It was himself. The reflection was perfect, down to the smallest scar on his hand and the crease in his armor. But the eyes, they were different. They glowed faintly, filled with malice and hunger. You've come far, the shadow said, its voice a chilling echo of his own. But you've only been running from the truth. Lysander's hand instinctively moved to the hilt of his sword, but the shadow chuckled. Do you think you can fight me? I am every selfish decision you've made, every cowardly choice. I am your greed, your pride, your fear. The shadow raised its hand, and the liquid ground beneath them rippled violently. Out of the ripples rose shapes, phantoms of those Lysander had wronged. Oren, the soldiers who had fallen under his command, even his father's ailing form, all stared at him with unrelenting accusation. You carry their weight, the shadow hissed. You wear their suffering as your crown. Do you think a single act of courage can undo the pain you've caused? The phantoms began to close in, their hands outstretched, their eyes empty. Lysander drew his sword, but the blade felt heavy, its edge dulled by the burden of his guilt. He swung, but the figures were immaterial, passing through his blade like smoke. "You cannot fight what you refuse to face," the shadow said. Lysander dropped his weapon, his chest heaving. He fell to his knees, the weight of his sins crushing him once more. But then he remembered his mother's words, the memory that had guided him through the song of truth. A true king must face his failures with courage and strive to do better. Steeling himself, he rose to his feet. "You're right," he said, his voice trembling but firm. "I have caused pain. I've made choices I can never undo. But I'm still here. I can choose to be better." The shadow tilted its head, its glowing eyes narrowing. Words are hollow without action. Lysander took a step forward, and then another, until he stood face to face with the shadow. "Then I'll prove it. Not to you, but to them." He extended his hand toward the phantoms. To his surprise, they did not retreat. Instead, they faded, their forms dissolving into motes of light that surrounded him like stars. The shadow began to waver, its form losing definition. "You cannot banish me," it said, its voice growing fainter. "I will always be a part of you." "I know," Lysander replied, "but you will not define me." With that, the shadow vanished, leaving Lysander alone in the glowing abyss. A path of light appeared before him, leading to a pedestal where the Pearl of Eternal Radiance rested. Its luminescence was blinding yet warm, and as he approached, he felt a profound sense of peace. Reaching out, he took the pearl in his hands. Its surface was smooth and cool, and the moment his fingers touched it, a wave of energy coursed through him. The path began to dissolve, and the abyss quaked as though it were collapsing. A familiar voice echoed in his mind. It was Sirena. "Hurry, Prince. The depths do not like to let go of their prey." Clutching the pearl, Lysander ran, the glowing path crumbling behind him. The abyss roared, but he did not falter, and as he leaped into the void, he felt himself being lifted by a surge of water. He emerged gasping on the cursed shore, the pearl clutched tightly in his hands. Sirena stood near, her expression unreadable. "You have done what few ever could," she said, "but your journey is not over." Lysander knelt on the black sand of the cursed shore, the Pearl of Eternal Radiance cradled in his trembling hands. Its glow pulsed like a heartbeat, casting faint ripples of light across the desolate beach. Exhaustion weighed heavy on him, but a deeper feeling began to stir. A sense of accomplishment tempered by the gravity of what lay ahead. Sirena stood a few paces away, her silver hair flowing like a cascade of moonlight. For the first time, her expression was not one of disdain, but something softer, almost wistful. She stepped closer, her movements graceful yet deliberate, and her storm-grey eyes locked onto his. "You have the pearl," she said, her voice quiet, but carrying the weight of ages. "You've endured trials that would break most mortal. Yet I wonder, Prince, do you truly understand what you hold?" Lysander looked at the pearl, its light dancing in his palm like captured starlight. "It's more than a treasure," he said. "It's a second chance for my kingdom and for me." Sirena tilted her head, her lips curving into a faint, enigmatic smile. "You speak with conviction, but do you know the cost of using such a gift?" The prince frowned. "What do you mean?" "The pearl's magic is not boundless," Sirena said, her tone tinged with sorrow. "It grants what is needed, not what is wanted, and its power demands balance. Use it to heal your father and the land will prosper, but only if you remain true to the lessons you've learned. Betray that, and the pearl's light will fade, leaving only ruin in its wake." Her words hung in the air like a shadow over his triumph. Lysander clenched his fist around the pearl, its warmth seeping into his skin. He thought of his father, frail and dying, of his people, suffering under the weight of famine and war. He thought of his own failures, laid bare in the trials, and the responsibility that now rested on his shoulders. "I will not waste this chance," he said firmly. Sirena studied him for a long moment, as if searching his soul for hidden truths. Finally, she nodded. "Perhaps you won't, but there is one last thing you must know." She turned her gaze to the sea, her expression distant. "I was not always what you see before you. I was once human, like you." Lysander blinked in surprise. "You were?" She nodded, her voice quiet. "I was a queen, long ago, ambitious, proud, and blind to the needs of my people. I sought the pearl, believing it would make me immortal, invincible. I found it, but I failed its test. The pearl's guardian cursed me to remain here, bound to the ocean, until a mortal could prove themselves worthy where I could not." Her eyes, heavy with centuries of regret, returned to Lysander. "In you, I see hope, for your kingdom and for myself. The curse that binds me is breaking, thanks to you. But whether it will shatter completely depends on what you do next." Before Lysander could respond, the pearl in his hand began to glow brighter, its light expanding outward. The mist that shrouded the shore lifted, revealing a dawn unlike any he had ever seen. The sunlight broke through the clouds, and the dark water shimmered with gold. Sirena smiled faintly on a single tear slipping down her cheek. It seems the pearl has chosen you. Go now, Prince. Return to your kingdom and let its light guide you. The ground beneath his feet trembled, and the tide began to rise, though the waves were gentle, as if ushering him forward. Lysander took a step back toward his ship, the pearl's glow illuminating his path. "Will I see you again?" he asked, his voice tinged with genuine sadness. Sirena shook her head, her form beginning to dissolve into the golden light. "No, but I will watch from the sea. Remember, Lysander, the pearl's power is not a solution. It is a beginning. The rest is up to you." With that, she vanished, her body merging with the waves. Lysander stared at the place where she had stood, a profound sense of loss mingling with his determination. The journey back to Araldwyn was swift, as if the sea itself aided his return. When he arrived, he found his father on the brink of death, his breath shallow and his skin ashen. Lysander knelt by the king's side and held the pearl aloft. Its light enveloped the room, washing over the frail monarch. Moments later, the king's eyes opened, clear and bright. The pallor of his skin faded, and strength returned to his limbs. He looked at Lysander with a mixture of awe and pride. "You did it," the king whispered. The pearl's glow dimmed, and Lysander felt its warmth fade. He knew its magic had been spent, but the hope it ignited would endure. With his father healed and his people rallied by the miracle, Lysander began the arduous task of rebuilding his kingdom, not as the prince he once was, but as the ruler he had become. Far away, beneath the waves, Sirena swam freely for the first time in centuries. Her song, now one of hope, carried on the currents to those who dared to listen.